I'd like to tell you the story of the assassination of President Lincoln at Ford's Theater, the building you see in the center of the picture, April 14th, 1865. This is Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln and President Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln was from a Southern slave-owning family from Kentucky. Her family didn't really care for Mr. Lincoln, who was, of course, from Illinois. His father never actually, we think, learned to write his name. We know he signed his name with an X, and maybe Mr. Lincoln's father was illiterate. Well, Lincoln grew up in a kind of a poor background, which is not what Mrs. Lincoln was used to. She had been to some of the finest schools available in her area. She had been to a thing called finishing school, where she'd learn all the manners and how to behave at these Southern events like teas and dress fittings and things like that, a background that Mr. Lincoln just didn't have. They dated for a while, and the first time he asked her to marry him, she said no. Same thing happened the second and third times he proposed. Finally, on the fourth time, she accepted his proposal. By that time, Mr. Lincoln had become a successful lawyer, and things were looking a little better in his life. Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln had four sons. Son number one is Robert Todd Lincoln. Son number two was Edward Baker Lincoln, who died at age 3 before they went to Washington. Son number 3 is William, or Willie, and son number 4 was Tad. His real name was Thomas, but he went by Tad because his father thought he looked like a tadpole when he was first born. So this is Ford's Theater, where Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln attended a show called Our American Cousin the evening of April 14th. That's a Friday evening. General Lee had surrendered his Confederate Army of Northern Virginia on the previous Sunday, and everybody knows the war is winding down. And the Lincolns went out with some friends for an evening of entertainment. This is the stage in Ford's Theater the night of the assassination. Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln were sitting in this box with two friends, not people they knew well, Major Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They have their own interesting story of what happened to them later on in life. The stage is set up for Our American Cousin, a comedy show. Now, 1860s comedy, you and I probably wouldn't find funny, so we don't understand a lot of the humor in the show, but it was a comedy. It was kind of like your favorite movie. A lot of people had seen the show many times. You know, you can probably have a favorite movie that you've watched a lot, and you know all the lines. Well, the same is kind of true for Our American Cousin. It was a very popular show at the time. A lot of people had seen it many times and could probably quote half the show. The president's box is actually over the stage, about 10 feet above. There's a little picture of George Washington. Here's a little bit closer view. Picture of George Washington. Whenever the president came to see a performance at Ford's Theater, they would set up this special box for him. Here's the chair President Lincoln was sitting in. There's another chair and a couch in the box as well. This is John Wilkes Booth, the evil assassin. He was a supporter of the South, even though the whole rest of his family supported the North. And John Wilkes Booth was a famous actor. He was not acting in the show Our American Cousin being performed the night of Lincoln's assassination, but he was in Washington. He and a brother actually had planned to kidnap the president earlier and hold him for ransom. They wanted the North to have to end the war to get their president back. Well, that kidnapping plot didn't work, and the plan changed to an assassination. This is the chair the president was sitting in. This is something like how the president's box would have looked from inside the box the night of the assassination. And this is the little gun that John Wilkes Booth used to shoot him. It's just about the size of your palm. It's very tiny, little one-shot revolver. The story is the president and Mrs. Lincoln, Major Rathbone and Clara Harris went to Ford's Theater. They got there a little late. The show had already started. They enjoyed the rest of the first act. And in the second act of the show is when John Wilkes Booth got into the president's box. You know, nobody was really suspicious of him. He was an actor. Who is suspicious of seeing an actor in a theater? Nobody. The president's bodyguard, John Parker, was not present. He was supposed to be right outside the door of the president's box. It's one of the great mysteries is what happened to John Parker? Why did he do, well, an absolutely terrible job? You can't be worse than to be the president's bodyguard and have the president get killed. Well, John Wilkes Booth shot the president in Ford's Theater, jumped down onto the stage to make his escape, probably either badly sprained or maybe broke his ankle, maybe broke the small bone in his leg, ran across the stage, which of course interrupted the show, and eventually he'll get away into Virginia. We'll go back and tell that story in a little bit. President Lincoln was taken out of Ford's Theater. Unfortunately, they kind of put him on a door as a stretcher and carried him across the street to a house where sometimes actors who acted at Ford's Theater would rent the room in the back, the Peterson House. Oddly enough, the person who had slept in the bed the night before was John Wilkes Booth. He'd rented this room in his bed, assassinated the president the next night. President Lincoln was laid across the bed kind of diagonally because he was so tall, he didn't fit with a headboard and a footboard. And President Lincoln would die in that bed early the next morning of April 15th. John Wilkes Booth made his escape out the back door of the theater and took off on a horse, kind of a rented horse, almost like you might rent a car today. You could rent a horse then. Took off for Maryland and Virginia, hoping that he could get into Virginia where Southerners would welcome him with open arms. They would be so happy that President Lincoln was killed, John Wilkes Booth thought, that Southerners would protect him. Well, the way things turned out is John Wilkes Booth gets out of D.C., picks up some weapons at a place where he probably had planned a lot of this. His leg was hurting him very badly, so he stopped at the home of a doctor who took care of him. That doctor tried to convince Booth to stay the night, to just stay here the rest of the night. There's no reason to be out riding around on horseback with a broken leg at this time of night. Well, John Wilkes Booth says, "Oh, yes, I do have reasons." And so he kept going. He winds up down in some woods, hiding out in the woods. Of course, it seems like the entire United States Army is looking for the assassin. So Booth tries to lay low in the woods for a few days with a broken leg. He's hungry, he's tired, he's exhausted. He has a friend with him who's not much help. Eventually, Booth decides the time is right to get out of Maryland and into the South, where he hopes he will be protected. Well, through some confusion, he winds up back in Maryland and finally gets into Virginia. But by now, the United States Army has caught up to him. The U.S. Army surrounds a barn that Booth is hiding in, and this picture is trying to show you that his friend comes out. The Army orders Booth out of the barn. There are a lot of different versions of the story, but at least one version of the story is they light the barn on fire, shoot shots into the barn. Barn burns down on top of John Wilkes Booth. Another version of the story is that he comes out and turns himself in, having been shot by the Army and dies. There is a version of the story that says, the body they took out of the barn was not that of John Wilkes Booth. So you can, take your pick. But I think the most accurate version of the story is that Booth was captured but died very shortly thereafter from gunshot wounds. This is a wanted poster for the time. Mrs. Mary Surratt, whose boarding house John Wilkes Booth and others probably planned a lot of this in, is in the center. The others are other people who either helped Booth or tried to assassinate other government officials that same night. This man right here is somebody who actually grew up in York, Pennsylvania, and may well have been involved, even though he probably didn't understand that he was involved in an assassination. That picture is kind of gross, but there it is. 4 people are being executed by hanging for the Lincoln assassination. This is the funeral parade in Washington, D.C. For President Lincoln. A huge, huge parade mourning his death. This is his hearse being pulled by horses, soldiers with their guns pointed down in a not military sort of way. The president's body lay in state in the White House, in the East Room, and eventually in the U.S. Capitol building. Well, you don't remember being here because we were not able to go, but this is a statue called Freedom. It's one of the models of the statue that's on top of the building, on top of the dome. Back behind here is the catafalque that the president's body laid on. The president was then taken back to Illinois for burial on a special funeral train. There's a picture of Mr. Lincoln on the front of the train. That train took a long route through many, many towns in the nation on its way back to Illinois for burial. A lot of people would gather to see the train go by. perfectly silent crowds, just shocked at what happened. That train left Washington, D.C., went up through Baltimore into York, Pennsylvania on our rail trail. If you've been on the rail trail, you know President's body has been on that same rail line. There was supposed to be a ceremony in York, but it was raining really hard and it was canceled. So the president went from Harrisburg to Philadelphia to New York City, across railroad that has replaced the Erie Canal to Buffalo, down through Erie, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, Indiana, up to Chicago, and finally to Springfield, Illinois. And you might say, well, why didn't they just go straight to Springfield? That's a really weird way to do this. Well, there weren't railroads the whole way there. And so they had to go in kind of a circuitous path. Plus, that way more people could express their sympathy to the Lincoln family by watching the train go by. President Lincoln is buried in Springfield, Illinois in a private cemetery. Don't go there on a Monday because it's closed. Yes, I'm bitter that I took my family there on a Monday, not realizing the cemetery wouldn't be open, so we couldn't see the president's grave. He's buried down underground, about 9 feet below ground, under this big stone. There's a statue that looks like this at his burial, an exact copy of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. There's the Lincoln Memorial, and Mr. Lincoln is inside here. You've probably seen this on the back of a penny. So President Lincoln's assassination happened, and his son, Robert Todd Lincoln, the oldest son, was present when his father died in 1865. Well, Robert Lincoln went on to have a lot of high-level government positions. Robert Lincoln was traveling with President Garfield in 1881 when President Garfield was shot. As Garfield falls back from being shot, Robert Lincoln is the man who catches him. Another 20 years later, Robert Lincoln was in the room where President William McKinley was shot. And after that, of course, Robert Lincoln will not go anywhere a president will be because he's bad luck. Being present at his father's death, Garfield's assassination, and McKinley's assassination. But in 1921, when they're ready to dedicate the Lincoln Memorial, they invite Robert Lincoln to come. He's the only surviving of the 4 sons at this point. And Robert Lincoln says, well, will the president be there at the dedication? And when people tell him, yes, the president will be there, he says, I won't come because I'm bad luck for presidents. But they finally convince him, no, you have to come. It's your father's memorial dedication. You have to be there. And so they finally convinced him to come, where President Coolidge and former President Taft are also present. President Taft was dead just a few weeks later. And Robert Lincoln really won't go anywhere that a president has been. This is Robert Todd Lincoln's grave at Arlington National Cemetery, where he was buried actually 7 years after his death. His wife was a very private person. She didn't want anyone to know when he was buried at Arlington, one of our most famous cemeteries. So she had him buried somewhere else, and 7 years after his death, had him buried at Arlington. Well, that's the story of President Lincoln's assassination, a shock to the nation. No president had ever been assassinated before. We really never expected that sort of thing would happen. By the way, was John Wilkes Booth welcomed in the South with open arms? No. Southerners, well, maybe they weren't sad Lincoln had been killed, but that's not the way you do it. You don't assassinate a man at a social event in front of his wife and sneak up behind him from the back. The Southern Code of Conduct certainly says that's not the way to do it. Southerners did not welcome John Wilkes Booth with open arms. And that's how Booth wound up being captured and most likely killed.